Hello, everybody. Shalom l'kulam. Welcome to the Menachem Begin Heritage Center English Zoom. My name is Paul Gross, and this is our weekly discussion in English for an international audience. We have people based in Israel, people from the United States and Canada, and across Europe as well, and I think also South Africa. So welcome for another interesting discussion. We normally deal with issues, or we tend to focus on issues around Israeli politics and history in the wider Middle East, but we also touch on the wider Jewish world. And those of you who are regulars will know that a few months ago, I talked with Abe Foxman about anti-Semitism in the United States. And way back, some of you may remember a lecture that I gave about Jeremy Corbyn and leftwing anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, as it manifested in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn. So today we're going to be talking about both anti-Semitism in the United States and indeed anti-Semitism that comes from the left largely, and a particular form and a particular trend, relatively recent trend, that comes from what I guess colloquially is known as wokeism. We're going to be talking about it in its academic terminology as well. So they have critical social justice, and we have with us a perfectly placed expert to enlighten us and explain just what the hell is going on and what can be done about it. Just before I introduce him, for those that are new to this, what's going to happen is I'm going to talk to him for about half an hour, and then we're going to go to your questions, and you can write those questions into the chat at the bottom of your screen, and I will get to those questions and put them to our speaker at the end of my discussion with him. So, David Bernstein, the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and it's an organization which opposes illiberal ideologies and supports liberal values in and out of the Jewish community. David is also a co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values. He's past president and CEO of the Jewish Council of Public Affairs, former executive director of the David Project, and he spent 13 years at the American Jewish Committee as well in senior roles. He's a prolific speaker, writer, podcaster. He's written hundreds of op-eds in the Jewish and general press, and I'm delighted to have him with me virtually, at least today. David, how are you? Wait, you're just muted, David.
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Paul.
Great. So let's start with a sort of general question of definitions. When we talk about critical social justice, or what's sometimes called wokeism, what are we really talking about?
Sure. So in the wake of the George Floyd killing in the summer of 2020, there was an ideology that had been around a while that really swept through American institutions. Some called it wokeness or wokeism. You've heard it called critical race theory, which you could argue might be a simplification. You've heard it called cancel culture, which is sort of an expression of this ideology in the real world. And we often call it critical social justice. I often call it also critical race ideology or critical gender ideology, depending on how it's being manifested. That ideology did not appear out of thin air. It's been in the making for decades, and it comes out of the academy. And we can talk a little bit about how it came out of the academy and how it spread into mainstream institutions in American life. But it really has taken us by storm. I also should say that Jewish organizational life has not been spared. Jews love to be on the side of the angels, and we fashion ourselves to be closely tied, inextricably linked to the civil rights movement. And so Jews are naturally given toward this kind of ideological fad, if you will. What is this ideology? It really holds two things. And if I have to repeat it, I will, because I think it's really important that your viewers understand what this ideology actually is. It, on the one hand, believes that oppression and bias exist and are embedded in the very systems of society. Now, when we hear about oppression or we hear about racism, we usually think that is the attitude of an individual. But this ideology holds that it is embedded in the systems of society, and it's in the air, it's in every nook and cranny of society. The second thing it holds is that only those with the lived experience, only the victims of racism are in a place to be able to understand it, to see it, and to define it for the rest of society. So just to bring an example close to home, I'm Jewish. You're probably almost all, if not all of you are Jewish. You've experienced anti-Semitism, presumably at some point in your life. You understand what it is, some of you more than others. You're in a position to articulate your own lived experience of anti-Semitism. Fair enough, I think that's true. But this goes further. It says that if you don't have that lived experience, then you're not in a place to articulate that definition and what it means, and that you really have no standing to it. And that's the root of cancel culture. If someone is white is talking about racism, that person doesn't have the credibility to speak about the issue and is thus speaking out of term, is thus speaking from a place of privilege, and thus should be told that they're really out of line. So that really is where cancel culture comes from. It's a way of sort of shutting down this fundamental critique of the idea that racism and oppression are embedded in society. The other thing is, I think we can even agree that sometimes racism and oppression are embedded in society. Certainly, we've seen examples of that in Jewish history where we could say, yes, it's not just simply that there's anti-Semites who personally don't like Jews, but there are systems in that society that are biased against Jews. But again, it doesn't mean it's always the case. And it doesn't mean that the entire critique of those people are articulating about racism and systemic racism are always right. And that's really the problem. Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist, well-known social psychologist in America, likes to say that critical race theory is a bit cuckoo. And by that, he doesn't mean that it's crazy. He means it's a bit like the cuckoo bird, which goes into another bird's nest and kicks all the other eggs out. And I think it's fair to say that that's what critical race ideology does. It makes a set of claims, it articulates a set of theories of the world, and then it makes sure that there are no other acceptable lines of reasoning allowed to be expressed. So that's what we're dealing with. And I could stop here for a second, Paul, and talk a little bit about how that affects Jews, but I'll let you ask the questions.
Sure, thank you. So just before I do that, I just want to say that, like, looking at it from afar, and obviously not being in the US and Israel, I think has been blessedly pretty much sort of saved from this sort of ideology up to this point, at least. I'm sure there's reasons for that, but looking at it from afar, one of the things that strikes me, and you alluded to it, is how it's not just that, as you said, that those who are not in the minority group cannot define it, but those who are in the minority, those who are in the majority group, are almost intrinsically guilty before they've even said anything. They have something to atone for, right? That there's a kind of permanent status of the victim and the privileged, the victim class and the privileged class, and the victim class is always and perpetually deserving of some sort of advantage, and the privileged class is always going to be having to make some sort of atonement. And we've seen that in, like, the stuff about, kids at schools being asked to like white kids at schools being asked to say in front of their classmates what it means to them to be part of the privileged class or something like that. Have I got that sort of right?
Gotten it right. I think it gets a little complicated here. If you're white, according to this ideology, you are complicit in anti-whiteness, whether you know it or not. You may have the most friendly and warm attitudes toward people of color and other oppressed people, but because you are white, you are complicit in the oppression, unknowingly complicit in the oppression. And so you have to take very active steps. Now there are sort of the optimists and the pessimists within the critical race ideologue community. Some of them will say, yes, it can be overcome over time, and others will claim that it cannot be overcome over time. In other words, they don't believe that there's anything whites can do to ultimately not just atone, but to change the system so that it doesn't fundamentally benefit them. And those are some of the biggest radicals, because they believe that the only real solution then is to overturn the sort of social order as we know it. Right. So that is absolutely the case. And there are kids who are made to atone. I can tell you that one of my sons, who's 16, was recently asked in school to describe what he thinks it's like for Black people in America. And what he wanted to say is, I think Black people are as different from each other as white people are, but he held himself back because he knew it would absolutely be devastating for him in school, that he could not get away with that without being called a racist, probably by the teacher and by the students. So what they're actually doing is teaching a monolithic understanding of the Black experience. They're teaching a monolithic understanding of human disparity. So, and really what they're saying is there is no other acceptable explanation for why some people have more than others than supremacy and systemic racism or systemic advantage.
Right. It's a really extraordinarily, it's been extraordinarily successful in spreading through the institutions, and we'll talk about that. But let's get to the Jewish point and the anti-Semitism, because you established this organization, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. And you produced, the Institute has produced this white paper that I read, which is a really fantastic read and a really great piece of scholarship, where you talk about the increase, specifically the increase in anti-Semitism under critical social justice. So just as, I guess, to go back to my Jeremy Corbyn reference earlier, just as in so many other cases, the forces of so-called progress and equality on the left end up in one way or another as being responsible for an increase in anti-Semitism. Here, in a very specific way, or specific ways, plural, that has happened as well. So can you talk us through some of the ways in which critical social justice, wokeism have actually led to an increase in anti-Semitism?
Sure. So anybody who's been following the Arab-Israel conflict for many years, as I have, I've been part of the pro-Israel community really my entire career, could not help but notice that things really took a turn for the worse this past May during the Israeli-Hamas conflict in Gaza. Now, I've been an active participant in these discussions over many, many years. So I remember very well what it was like in 2018 when there was rocket fire, when there in 2014 and in 2009. I don't remember every single Israeli operation and what they were called, but I certainly remember what it was like to be part of those discussions. And it was always challenging. It was different this past May. It was clear that some of the mainstream media outlets that might have initially defended Israel for a few days before they turned, didn't even defend them in the early days. It was clear that this sort of American elite progressive class was no longer being even-handed or seeing nuance in it, but had seen this through the lens of sort of the oppressed versus oppressor paradigm. So we knew that there was something different. And this is exactly when we founded the organization in early May, prior to the Gaza conflict. We were concerned, first and foremost at that time, with how this ideology was distorting Jewish life and how it was undermining the deliberative process within the Jewish community. We saw really disturbing signs of that. And we knew that it had the potential to aggravate anti-Semitism, but we didn't fully define it at that time. But after Gaza, we knew it was a big problem. So how does it operate in that way? Number one, it uses this idea that certain identities have more privilege than others. So if you believe that whites inherently have more privilege than Black people in society, it's not a far cry to claim that Jews have more privilege than everybody else, because if you look at average household income or average educational achievement, Jews are always on the upper end of that, as are Asians, by the way. And I think there's been an uptick in anti-Asian sentiment. And many times Asians are considered white adjacent or white complicit because of their of their advantage. Because if you believe that the only reason why some people are more advantaged than others is because of oppression and discrimination, then those who are doing well are going to be viewed as oppressors. Another major factor here is what we've seen is called, we call it the erasive anti-Semitism. The Reut group in Israel coined that term. And it's this very idea that either you're white or you're oppressed, and forcing Jews to define as white people and not allowing us to define ourselves as a distinct people worthy of self-determination. That's another way that this ideology functions to encourage and fuel Jew hatred. Another way is sort of the marginalization of Jews in politics. And you could argue that's not specifically anti-Semitism, it's more of an effect of what this ideology does. But I know, Paul, that you and others were following carefully what happened in the UK with the rise of Jeremy Corbyn. And if you see these kind of ideological forces arise in American society, it's not going to be long before this octogenarian leadership of the Democratic Party eventually loses its grip, and that more critical forces, angry forces are going to take hold in the party. And we can see the Corbynization of American politics and hence the marginalization of American Jews in politics. You know, and there are other things that this does as well. I could go into it. One of them, of course, is that it actually empowers radical Muslim voices in American foreign policy. There's this phenomenon that the Reut Institute calls the Red-Green Alliance that we first saw in Europe, where radical Muslim groups made common cause with radical progressive groups and started pushing for a common agenda, even though you would think on paper that they have very little in common. That's happening now in the United States, and woke ideology is making that much, much easier. And we're starting to see these Muslim groups sort of ride the wake of woke ideology so that they can become more influential on the Abraham Accords and the like. So those are some, I could speak more, those are some manifestations of this. Interestingly, Andrew Sullivan, who many of you know, one of the great writers and thinkers, public intellectuals, recently wrote a piece on this. And his basic argument was that even the critique of whiteness itself, the idea of white supremacy itself, gives rise to anti-Semitism. Because once you decide that white people themselves are inherently racist, are inherently flawed, are inherently domineering, it will almost always morph into anti-Semitism. And I think that was his innovation in the discussion as well. So this really functions in a multiplicity of ways to inflame anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic sentiment.
That's really interesting. I'll have to read that Andrew Sullivan piece. It's interesting because what you described, the Red-Green Alliance, I mean, coming from the UK, that's something that I'm very familiar with from my days, you know, where I saw, you know, during the Second Lebanon War, left-wing white British people marching down with Hezbollah flags, right? It's kind of this sort of bizarre idea that they have something in common, that as progressives they have something in common with this anti-gay, misogynist, terrorist, anti-Semitic Islamist organization. But it's fascinating. I always thought, I think clearly naively, that America would be immune to this kind of thing, and I think it's taken the arrival of this ideology to transform the American left in this way, I guess.
Yes, and actually I'd like to say something on that. You know, I grew up in college as a Jewish and pro-Israel activist, and I remember encountering some of my British counterparts and feeling that they were much more ideological than any American liberal I knew. And I think if you looked at it, going back at sort of classical American liberalism and left of center thinking, if you looked at the classical, let's say, New York Jew, who was a liberal, who believed who understood that there were people who had more than other people, that there were haves and have-nots, they were prescriptive but not descriptive. In other words, they understood that there were people who had more than others, but they didn't have a grand theory as to why that was the case. They just believed that we had to do our part to make sure that we gave people every advantage that they could. but they didn't theorize about it. And it always hit me that what we saw in Europe, which was much more sort of edgy, ideological, could eventually make its way in the United States. And it's almost ironic that actually once this ideology hit the United States, that it's actually become more charged than anywhere in Europe that I've seen so far.
Right, that's interesting. That's interesting. So let me just bring Israel into things as well, because the other thing I've noticed about, and you also touch on this in the white paper, is that there's this, and I guess this came up, of course, during the May anti-Israel protests over the war with the conflict with Hamas, that I saw demonstrations in New York, and I would hear people that had been very involved in Black Lives Matter and all the aftermath of the George Floyd killing, talking about the Palestinians as essentially the African Americans of the Middle East conflict, and of course, Israel were the white oppressors. So it's this cut and paste of the racial conflict in America, which has literally zero to do with the Israeli-Arab conflict, and just saying, okay, now we understand what's happening in Israel-Palestine because we understand whites and blacks in the United States.
Yes, it's a very simplistic template, and it will be applied. And I know that there are some of my colleagues who think, well, maybe Jews have to then go through a process of defining ourselves as indigenous people. Maybe we have to redefine ourselves as the victim class here. I have to tell you, I think that's an impossible task. It's just not going to happen. We've already been defined as the victim class, the dominant class. It is not doable. It is not a reclamation project that will work. Yeah. And we have to sort of come to terms with that ourselves and understand that this is probably just an ideology that we're going to have to fight. And that's really, by the way, there's a really big strategic dilemma in the American Jewish community on this. And I don't want to make light of it because it is quite complicated. I mean, let me give you an example of how this plays out. In the state of California, which is the largest population-wise of any state, there was a curriculum called the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum that was being debated. This curriculum was built on the foundation of critical race ideology. And in its initial drafts, it pretty much left out of the Jewish narrative. And the Jewish community had a choice. Can we accept this critical race framework and then try our hardest to make sure that Jewish narratives are included? Or should we oppose this framework as being inherently problematic because eventually that ideology is going to give rise to anti-Semitism in one way, shape, or form? And there were groups that lined up on both sides of that question, and it continues to be fought. And there's going to be other examples of that as well in other states as this model curriculum takes place in other state capitals as well. And I think that's going to be a fundamental dilemma. I used to argue and believe, well, we got to take what we can. We got to get what we can. I no longer believe that that's the case. I believe this ideology is inherently problematic. And right after that, the Jewish narrative was, to a degree, put into the model ethnic curriculum in California. There's now a group called the Liberated Ethnic Studies curriculum that's pushing a viciously anti-Israel and anti-Semitic curriculum in individual school districts on the backs of the model curriculum that was passed by the state. And there are already several school districts that have bought into it. So you're constantly going to be dealing with this. It's like a game of whack-a-mole with this ideology in place. It's going to constantly producing anti-Semitism. You're going to constantly fighting it. And that's why I think that the mainstream Jewish community has to get a grip and understand this ideology is going to be inherently problematic to us.
Wow. And in terms of your organization, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, you're looking to, in part, you're looking to educate Jewish community organizations, right? To sort of somehow, what do you want to, what information do you want to impart to them? What do you want to tell them? What do you want to teach them about this ideology and the danger of it to them as institutions?
Right. So it really is in two levels. First, I want them to understand that their own closely held liberal values are being compromised. And by liberal, I don't mean left-wing values. I mean that their values as organizations that welcome discourse, the idea of machloket l'shem shamayim, the idea of arguments for the sake of heaven, which is central to Jewish thought. That's going to give way to this ideology that really shuts down debate and discussion on issues. And I saw this firsthand when I was working for mainstream Jewish organizations, how this ideology short circuits the deliberative process. It kills viewpoint diversity within Jewish organizations. So any synagogue or any group that fashions itself as respecting multiple viewpoints is going to lose that sense of itself by embracing this ideology. So that's one way to understand the price that Jewish organizations have paid and will continue to pay. And many of them are completely blind to this. There's always people within the organizations that understand the problem, but a lot of the organization is just completely blind to what's going on. Then the other is that by embracing this ideology, which many of them do, they are basically fanning the flames of anti-Semitism without even knowing it. They're reinforcing this ideology. They're giving it credibility, and they're allowing it to be weaponized against the Jewish community. They're also on another level, by the way, they're also lowering our resilience to fight anti-Semitism. If you teach a generation of young Jews in Jewish day schools, and we're seeing this be taught in Jewish day schools, certainly in pluralistic Jewish day schools, that they are complicit in white supremacy, how do you think when faced with anti-Semitism, they're going to be able to fight back against it? If they see themselves as inherently guilty and they've internalized that sense of guilt, I think it is disastrous for the Jewish community. I think we're very slow to understand it. There are more and more people who are starting to ask some pointy questions, but we're at the very beginning of this process.
Right. And just to go back to the question of the politics question, capital P politics in the United States, again, looking at it from the outside, not living in the United States, not from the United States, but Joe Biden won the Democratic nomination. And I think for many of us, that was a relief because he was it showed that the Democratic Party, at least the masses of Democrats voting in the primaries wanted the moderate candidate, not Bernie Sanders, not Elizabeth Warren. They wanted the very middle of the road guy, who has a very strong pro-Israel record going back many years. But it does seem like I don't know whether he has bought into this or that he just feels himself to be powerless to stand against it. But the language, at least what I see, the language coming out of the Democratic Party seems to be very either completely pro the sort of critical social justice ideology, or at least completely unwilling to critique it, to stand against it. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I do see it that way. I think it's important to understand how this ideology functions in institutions. Once an institution decides that they're going to accept their complicity in white supremacy, and many have, as I said, many Jewish organizations have, they sort of sign on the dotted line. Some have called this identitarian deference. They signed on the dotted line in the ideology. It's very, very hard to extricate themselves from it once they've agreed to the fundamental observations. So even if it's no longer politically in their advantage, it becomes hard for them to divorce themselves of the ideological commitments that they've made. And you're seeing this play out in the Democratic Party now, because clearly the elections that you saw a few months ago, in which a Republican governor beat out a mainstream Democrat by large margins, after Biden had won the national election by large margin, when you saw defeats in places like Minneapolis and Buffalo, you can see how that makes no political sense for the Democratic Party. And there was an argument that perhaps the Democrats, after this last election, will understand what they've done and they'll start moving away from woke ideology. And you had figures like James Carville, who is one of the great, Democratic political strategists, who says the Democratic Party's got to sort of de-wokeify itself, do woke detox. Yet he didn't win out, clearly, because you heard a lot of Democratic leaders now say that that this is just a big Republican manipulation and not take any responsibility for the political implications of these of woke ideology and how it plays out in politics. So what it tells you is that institutions have a very hard time ridding themselves, even if it's in their own best interest. Let me give you another example of how this can work. There's a young woman that you're going to hear about publicly not too long. She is an attorney who works for a domestic violence organization in a major city. And she's Jewish, very actively Jewish. And she was asked to sign a contract, as were all other white employees, that all white people are racist and I'm no exception. She was also asked to participate in white affinity groups. And when she raised the issue of anti-Semitism in a conversation on diversity that the organization was having, she was accused of decentering anti-Blackness. In other words, taking the spotlight away from the anti-Black racism, and was really actually called on the carpet for it. It wasn't just she was just told she was wrong. She was spoken to by her supervisor afterwards. Now, you would think if you were the board of trustees of this organization and you knew this was happening, that you would say, this is a risk. We're going to get sued. This is anti-white and anti-Jewish discrimination, and we're going to get sued. But there was absolutely no action taken on the part of the board. And that's because once they've signed onto this ideology, it is very hard to do that, to distance themselves from it.
Wow. That is absolutely bonkers. Bonkers
it's
situation.
Funny, by the way, because I hear from a lot of my Israeli friends who, these are very often very liberally minded people who say, what the hell is going on in your country? I know you're fighting it, but what the hell is going on in your country?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's when we hear things like that, it makes us, for some of us looking from the outside, we see an American, I'm going to speak for myself actually, rather than everyone else. It's not fair to impose my perspective on everyone else, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who looks at the United States and sees the Republican Party dominated by former President Trump, who you can like or dislike what he did as president and whatever he did and things he did for Israel, undoubtedly very popular in Israel, but also tried to overturn a legitimate election and incited a mob against the Capitol, right? So that's the Republican Party. And then the Democratic Party, as we've discussed, seems to be heading off the woke cliff, so to speak. So where, and actually, maybe this will be my last question before we get to questions from the audience. You refer on the website to the need for a centrist coalition, like which spans center left to center right, and maybe that's sort of what that relates to what I've just talked about. How would you go about creating that? What do you envisage when you think about that? And is that just in society? Is that in terms of, again, capital B politics with Republicans and Democrats that are willing to sign up to that?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm grateful that you mentioned the right as well, because I think it's only right that we mention that there certainly is a counterpart on the right. It is different. It perhaps is not as coherent as what you're seeing on the left. One keen observer, I'm not sure if he wants to be quoted, so I won't use his name, said that what we're experiencing is a heart attack on the right and a cancer on the left, a slow-growing cancer on the left. And I think that's true. And, and even though I'm somebody of sort of the center left, I'm more eager to fight the battle on my own backyard, because I think that's where I have the most impact. So I've been very interested in rethinking who we engage in the Jewish community on the outside. For many years, the pro-Israel community understood that we faced a battle for the hearts and minds of progressives, and that's really what was at stake with the BDS and anti-Israel delegitimization campaign, and that we had to find folks on the left who hadn't yet made up their minds, who were sitting on the fence, and sort of bring them to our side. So at least they would have a more complicated picture and not join forces with the BDS radical forces. I don't think, well, I'm glad there's still groups doing that, and I'm certainly not urging that anybody stop doing that work. I think that the locus of priority should move from that work to building a center-left to center-right coalition, that ultimately the Jewish community is going to be safer, more secure by having a coalition of people spanning both parties who want to protect democracy, who believe in our small L liberal values, that is the ability for people to have conversations and are willing to have conversations with the people they disagree with, that those are more important issues than whatever our stance might be on how much government there should be and how much healthcare there should be. Those are important issues as well, but that we ultimately need to agree on protecting democracy and standing up for these liberal principles. And so that's the concept of sort of rebuilding the center that we're actively promoting. We believe that American Jews should focus on rebuilding the center and make sure that we're secure in a robust center in American politics.
Great. I think that's
and that includes new groups that haven't yet been organized. That includes Asian Americans, for example, who also have a stake in this battle, and they're worried that their kids are being displaced in sort of this anti-meritocratic move on the left. It includes Black heterodox thinkers who don't like the fact that this is happening to their own community and don't want their kids to be told that the system is rigged against them, because they understand if that's what their kids believe about America, they're not going to reach their full potential. They're going to always think that the system is rigged against them. So those are our future allies. There are Latino groups. There are Muslim groups, by the way, as well, who want to protect a liberal America and are willing to work together to do that. And that's our next move, is to really build bridges to those groups.
That's really great. Yeah, I was going to say, I think some of the most impressive speakers and writers that I've heard speaking against this have actually been African Americans. Like people like John McWhorter and Coleman Hughes, people like that are really, really great.
Absolutely. Glenn Lowry and others.
Right.
I'd urge you to listen to some of their podcasts. They often have much more depth of knowledge than some of the other critics of the
exactly. Yeah, and they can speak to it. They can speak to what it's like to be on the receiving end of to know. They know the history of slavery and the civil rights struggle, and they reject the way it's being, what anti-racism has come to mean, right, in this. And also it's sort of in a way, it's almost the opposite of Martin Luther King's famous, judge people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Because this anti-racism is saying, no, you absolutely judge people by the color of their skin. You absolutely distinguish between blacks and whites.
Right. John McWhorter calls this third wave anti-racism, and meaning that this is very different from the second wave that we saw in the civil rights era. And my argument is we now need a fourth wave of anti-racism, an anti-racism that understands, by the way, that there are deep disparities in American society that must be overcome. In other words, there's the fact that there are still disparities, let's say, in the criminal justice system, shouldn't be overlooked. We should fight against that, but we shouldn't also do it in a way that practices a kind of reverse discrimination. So, for example, if we all understand that there are fewer Black scientists than there ought to be, the answer is not what Ibrahim X. Kendi's definition of equity, which is to immediately create equal numbers of Black scientists, but rather to understand that we have a long-term investment to make. Let's go out there and build a pipeline of young Black scientists. Let's invest in STEM education so that there are young people now who are willing to become scientists in the long run. You just can't make up for that immediately, and that's what the third wave anti-racism tries to do. That will not work. It will fail, and it will not advance the interests of the very people that it purports to help.
Right. Okay, let's get to some questions. Thank you. Firstly, that was a fantastic sort of opening presentation, and each question that I asked was answered in great detail. It was fantastic. So let's get some questions here. So Jacqueline, who is based in the UK, asks about, she's expressing some astonishment that all Jews are considered white. And she asks, what about Mizrahi, Sephardi, Yemenite Jews, Ethiopian Jews? Does that come into the conversation at all when people talk about Jews as white?
So there is a recognition in these ideological circles that there are non-white Jews, and they'll often say that those people are also victims of racism, and can be victims of racism coming from the Jewish community, by the way, as well. And so, and that, by the way, that's not completely untrue. I think it's true that there are Black Jews who have suffered some discrimination in Ashkenazic, synagogues, or Mizrahi Jews as well. So it's not like it's completely untrue. But so they will acknowledge that diversity, but they'll say, by and large, the American Jewish community is dominated by white Ashkenazic Jews, and that they have benefited from white privilege, and that they have actively benefited from white privilege and have become, in a sense, white. And that whiteness gives them advantage that they're willing to exploit.
Okay. Thank you. There's a question here from, excuse me, Shmuel Yerushalmi here in Israel, who's asking about, I guess he's asking about how this connects to, more traditional forms of left-wing anti-Semitism. For example, Israel boycotts from trade union, from the labor movement and that sort of thing. BDS. How does this connect to that?
Yeah, so this ideology has been around much longer than I think we recognize. It just hasn't caught on in America in the way it has. And I think that ideology has really all along been fueling anti-Israelism. If you go back to the Durban conference, I think it was in 2001.
2001.
I think it was, 2001. You already saw sort of what you would at that time called post-colonial ideology being weaponized against Israel. So Israel was responsible for the systematic oppression of people, of the Palestinian people. It's sort of within this framework of like the global North is fundamentally oppressing the global South. That's been around, and woke ideology is basically taking post-colonial ideology and applying it to domestic politics. So that frame has been around, and I believe that has been fueling anti-Israelism and anti-Semitism for many years, particularly in Europe. But now it's catching on in a way that it hadn't before in the United States, and that's why you're seeing this situation exacerbated in the way that it has.
Right. Thank you. Stephen Nadler, he's looking for recommendations. He's asking, what media outlets that cover anti-Semitism in an objective manner do you recommend? I think he's based in the United States.
Sure. Well, you can read Tablet Magazine, which has some brilliant articles on these issues. You can read the new Sapir Journal, which is a fantastic new journal that's
Brett Stevens' journal?
That's Brett Stevens is the editor-in-chief. And it's got some amazing articles about this very phenomenon. So I'd recommend looking at I think they've had 4 issues out now, looking at those articles and reading through them. There's a great essay by our board chair, Pamela Paresky, called Critical Race Theory and the Hyper-White Jew. If you read one essay, read that. Okay. Andrew Sullivan's blog, Barry Weiss's Substack, by the way, is also an amazing resource. Those are the people who are writing about these issues and writing compellingly about it. You can look on our website, by the way, jilv.org, and go under resources. And we have a whole resource page with many articles on how critical social justice ideology fuels anti-Semitism. And you can read our white paper right there. Okay, so jilv.org, I've just written it in the chat.
During the course of the rest of this, I'll try and write in the chat also the names of the journals that David mentioned. There's a question here. Let me just find it again. Sorry. Oh yeah. So there's a question. Sorry, I'm sorry. I don't know what name it is because the the name written here is not, it's hard to determine what the first name is. But the question, it's not so much a pushback, but it's a little bit of a sort of, I guess, a minor clarification. They say that whilst they agree with you about the definition of critical theory of social justice, and they actually deal with this problem in their workplace, they say that the color of one's skin is not something you can camouflage. And it is different being Black to being Jewish, right? So you can, if you're Black and you go into a bank for a loan, you might be denied it on your race, but if you're Jewish, you can change your last name and you won't necessarily be identified as Jewish. So what would you say to that? So there is a difference, that the Black experience is different from the Jewish experience.
Yeah, I think that's true. The Black experience is different from the Jewish experience. I think that there are, it's not that this ideology is totally wrong all the time.
Right.
It's just that it's not always right, and we should be able to critique it. So, how racist is American society today? That's a matter for debate, right? I mean, what is the Black experience in America vis-a-vis racial oppression? Well, it depends on who you ask, by the way. Blacks are not of one mind on this. There's great diversity of thought within the Black community. If you want to read about that, look at Free Black Thought or the Journal of Free Black Thought. They're a wonderful resource of articles and ideas of Black thinkers who do not necessarily abide by this. So I would agree with that if you look at the criminal justice system in the United States, there still is arguably discrimination there, that drug charges against Black people are sometimes prosecuted more harshly than drug charges against white people. And there are other examples of this, but I believe that is not beyond debate and inquiry. I think we should always be open to the idea. And the more we talk about it, the more likely I'll be convinced that there is actual racism. And I think that's one of the problems here, is that by urging people to adopt this ideology in whole, you actually don't debate the topic and you don't really convince everyone. You just simply force compliance. And that's really what's happening today.
Right, that's a really good point. And it gets to this fundamental point, which you mentioned at the beginning, about the cancel culture and the fact that really at the root of it, like your organization, the reason it's called Institute for Liberal Values is because there's this fundamental value of freedom of speech and free expression, and the ability to argue and debate in civil discourse, which is being denied by this ideology. There was a comment by, it wasn't a question, but a comment by one of our audience, David, who said that it reminds him of this ideology reminds him of a dictatorship that gets, or a political party that gets elected and then cancels any further elections. It's a sort of,
right.
It's that kind of...
It is in many ways a power play, right? It's right. It is a power play. It is a very well-designed power play, by the way, as well. It makes it very hard for people to push back, and so they tend to acquiesce.
Right. So I must say that the questioner whose name I couldn't identify is Isabel Margolin. Sorry, Isabel, for not knowing that was your name. There's a question. Okay, so Carol Goldberg says, this is a depressing discussion. What can we do? So what can we do? Because you're a doer, David. You're a doer.
Yeah, I'm a doer, and I'm not just Schrein Gewalt about this. We are working very hard. Look, here's the secret. The vast majority of people are quite reasonable and don't buy into this ideology, right. But they've been sort of cowed into silence. So what is our central task? Our central task is to bring people out of the woodwork, to bring people into, in their synagogues, and to say, I want there to be more viewpoints at the table. I do not accept that this is the only way to look at racial justice or to look at gender ideology. I believe that there must be other ways and other voices that we must hear. And the more people do that in Jewish life, the more we'll be able to change institutions. That's the same with literally every other institution. As soon as they realize that there's critical mass moving in another direction, they start to rethink their ideological commitments. So we've got to change that dynamic. And the dynamic is not to convince everybody who disagrees with us in this case. That's not what we're after. What we're after is to find the people who already agree with us and to bring them out of the closet. And I think that works, and we're seeing it work. If a Jewish day school, for example, and there are real examples of this, buys into this ideology and starts to teach it in their curriculum, and we can get a critical mass of parents to say, this is problematic. We don't want our children believing that America and being white is complicit in white supremacy. We don't want our kids to think that. We want our kids to be able to question ideas and not be told what to think. As soon as they start to do that, the school starts to bend. So we believe that there's a lot of possibility here, and we just have to start finding people who agree, and then giving them all the encouragement and talking points and encourage that they need to go out and speak up.
Fantastic. We have a question here. I wondered if this was going to come up. And I know it's something you've written about very recently. Alan Rotter asks about the recent controversy around the definition of racism that the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, had on their website, which they changed rather hurriedly after it got a lot of pushback. And this definition of racism, I don't have the full wording here, but essentially it was a kind of, I think it would be fair to say, a critical race theory definition of racism, right? It was talking about that racism was the oppression of people of color based on a socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people, which is, you know, the language of the woke language. And of course, particularly striking for the ADL, which was set up to establish anti-Semitism, it excludes Jews. So what do you have to say for this? How could this have happened in the ADL? How did this happen?
So I'll read you the definition that they came up with a while ago, by the way. This was not just last week, but it came to light just last week. Defined racism as the marginalization and oppression of people of color based on socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people. Now, what somebody did on Twitter was take that definition and take the ADL's old definition of racism, which was which were attitudes of hate toward people of color and others, and put them side by side so that people could see how the definition had changed. This unleashed a fury of criticism against the ADL, and there was clearly an internal reckoning, and Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO, issued a mea culpa. There's an article in Medium where he talks about that. And he now made the definition more complicated to sort of embrace both the original definition and this newer definition, which you might call systemic racism. And you know, I understand that. And look, I think that the ADL is a really important organization. Let me just say that. They've done very important work in monitoring and fighting hatred. And I've been a long time admirer of the ADL. That said, this was just the tip of the iceberg. The ADL's education work, its implicit bias work, has for several years really embraced this ideology and teaches teachers in this ideology. And if you want to read about that, I have an opinion piece that I co-wrote with a woman named Brandy Shufutinsky. It is in the foreword yesterday. The article is called What Counts as Racism? How the ADL's woke definition caused an uproar and should be a cautionary tale. And we point to some of the other materials that the ADL has, which is teaching this binary of oppressor versus oppressed, which links identity to privilege and power. And once you do that, you're basically enabling anti-Semitism. And so we're tough on the ADL, even though we respect the ADL and what it has done historically and what it continues to do on many fronts, and believe that the ADL has to have another internal reckoning that goes beyond the debate over the definition that they have, and understand that this is causing, that they're, in a sense, fighting both sides on the war against anti-Semitism.
Right. I've just sent the link to that article in the chat, so that everyone can go to the chat and see the link to David's recent piece in the forward. Also, if you scroll up the chat, I also wrote the names of the recommended media that David suggested. There's a question here from Linda. I think it gets, to some extent, it also speaks to your past life with the David Project. It says, how do you address the indoctrination in the school system and college campuses? Young people are being bullied into groupthink, and Israel is seen in a negative way. So it's the campus issue, which I know you used to deal with many years ago, and also this new issue, like it's combined, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely some bullying going on. There's some ideological enforcement. I mean, most people wouldn't dare, a young person in high school or college wouldn't dare speak out against this ideology. It's just too fraught for them. And that is going to have an impact on how campus functions. I can tell you, I was executive director of the David Project between 2010 and 2015. I was involved in Israel advocacy on campus, and I was intimately familiar with the Israel scene on most campuses. And from 2010 till 2013, I would have characterized the fundamental vibe on campus as being soft postmodern. And by that, I mean that most students, if you were an elite student, if you were in the student government, if you were involved in progressive causes, you would believe that all narratives are equal and that everybody has a narrative and we should respect everybody's narrative. So you would believe, for example, that the Palestinian narrative is valid, so is the Israeli narrative, and let's listen to each other's narratives and come to an understanding. Now, you might not like that ideology, but that was the sort of dominant ideology. And about 2013 to 2014, with the rise of Black Lives Matter, you could feel the shift in attitudes. And it went from that soft postmodernist framework to this idea that there are oppressed and there are oppressors. And the oppressors must give power to the oppressed. It was a very sudden change in the fundamental ideology in American society on the left that immediately took root on campus, and we could feel that happening. We saw it happening, just 6 or 7 years ago, but it's gotten much, much worse in the post George Floyd era.
Wow. Okay, David, thank you very, very much for your time. I think we're out of questions, and we've heard some really some disturbing stories and some disturbing news, but also I think some good advice and recommendations. And most of all, I think we should all be very much appreciative of the work that you're doing in this field, because it clearly is something which could in theory be a serious problem, to say the least, for American Jews. Coming from a direction which I think American Jews the direction they hadn't been looking in, shall we say, in at least until very recently. So thank you very much, David. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for the questions. Email me, paulg@begincentre.org.il, to be on my mailing list for the events that we're doing here in English, both on Zoom and for those of you in Israel here at the Begin Centre in person. Again, David's organization's website, jilv.org, and he's just written his email address, david@jilv.org, for you to get in touch with him. There's some really great stuff on there. I can't recommend enough the white paper on the increase in anti-Semitism. It's really informative. So thank you, everyone. Thank you again, David, for your time. Everyone have a great day, great evening, and I'll see you all soon.